Good day, everyone. Welcome to this video on readings in Philippine history. My name is Attorney Robert John Donesa. I am an instructor of readings in Philippine history. Today, we have a very special topic because, as we all know, Philippine history is almost always, based on records. But today, we will be studying an object as a source of history. So, traditionally, history is defined as the systematic study of the past through the study of written records. The unwritten rule is that if there are no records, then there are no history. That's the unwritten rule. But today we ask the question, can an object or an artifact left behind by our ancestors living in the past be a source of history? And if it's a source of history, how do we classify the objects or the artifacts? Are they primary source or secondary sources? And what stories do they tell? Can we actually cull from them or infer from them our cultural beliefs and practices, our belief in the afterlife, the social hierarchy, our system of government, the way we deal with life, or even our economic activities? Can this object hold the key to congealed information about our past? And can we unravel them as we study these objects very closely? This and more as we study objects of Philippine history. For today, we pick up one object that is very familiar to majority of us Filipinos. It's very familiar because we are aware or at least informed about the so-called Manunggul Jar when we were in our basic education years. When we browse our textbooks, we see a familiar jar, the so-called Manunggul Jar. This jar, we always see them in our elementary textbook, and we were informed that the ancient Filipinos, the Katutubo, so we will call them in this lecture, the Katutubo referring to indigenous Filipinos. Our Katutubo used this jar as a burial jar. And looking at this jar, we see that it's a work of fine art. It is actually reflective of our being a Filipino, that our journey to discovering who we are is actually made easier because of the presence of this jar, our being Filipino. So, the national government actually declared this jar a Philippine national treasure because of its artistic and cultural value. So can this jar tells us about ourselves? Can this jar tells us a story of our past at least 2000 years ago? We will appreciate more about this jar as we will know that it's 2000 years ago and that those years are years beyond when the Spaniards and the Europeans actually changed the cultural landscape of the Philippines. So this jar is a symbol, a representative of our past culture beyond European changing of our cultural landscape. Let's take a closer look at the jar. If we take a look at the jar, we notice that in its covering or in its lid, it's artistically designed. The lid has two figurines on top riding a boat. And behind the boat or below the boat, we see curvilinear drawings or designs, which tells us, like, it reminds us of waves. It reminds us of waves plus the boat. So we see a context of a journey here, and also that this is a burial jar. This could be a journey to the afterlife. So indeed, this object is very important culturally to us Filipinos, because it may not have words that would tell us what it is, or it may not have written letters that would reveal us about it. It tells us more by simply the design and the usage and its placement in the archaeological setting where it was found. Let's take a closer look at the top, which is the most important part of the jar. We see two individuals riding on a boat. And if we take into context how the individuals were actually designed or made, we see their eyes, rounded eyes of the two individuals, including the boat, if you notice. The boat has a face, the boat has eyes. And in the Philippines, rounded eyes would actually tell us that the person is dead, the hollow eyes. And also the placement of the person's hands crossed in his chest. That is also the way native Filipinos, katutubo, arrange their dead before burial. And even the Christianized Filipinos also do the same arrangement, but they place sometimes a rosary on the hands, emphasizing Christianity. But still the same. Crisscrossing the hand on the chest is actually a symbol of dead people to be buried. So let's take the other look. We notice that there is a band being tied from head to the jaw. We notice it on the first individual or the individual in front. It is also a practice among Filipinos to tie the head and the jaw to keep it in place, because the jaw may fall open. But Filipinos really indeed close it, like tied it with a band. No? It is a symbol of being dead. Surprisingly, we can also see the same features on the second man rowing the boat. His head is also tied. A band was also tied, placing his jaw, putting them together, like tying them together. And his eyes are also hollow. Does it mean that this person, the second one, rowing or steering the boat, is this person also dead? So it means that the three of them are dead, like the boat has the same eye features. So these are the questions we need to ask and we need to be answered in our cultural context. Are all of them dead? Or only the one sitting in front is dead The other one is a relative, the so called sundo, or the relative fetching the dead. How do we interpret this figurine? So it makes Manunggul Jar a very interesting jar because it has a lot of story to tell about us, about you and me, about our being a Filipino. What about you? What do you think? How do we interpret these givens? Like the given is the jar is a burial jar. The given is the givens are there are two figurines designed on top of the lid of the jar, and both of them are tied with a band on their face, placing holding the jaw together with the skull, which is also a symbol of the dead in the Philippines. And then hands crisscross, hollow eyes for all of the three, including the boat. What do you think? What cultural practices can we call or infer from this artifactual setup? Of course, we need to understand the context first. We need to understand where the jar was actually excavated. We need to look into the Manunggul cave first. The Manunggul cave is a burial cave on a sheer cliff overlooking the West Philippine Sea on the western side of Lipun Cave or Lipun Point. It was discovered in 1964 by Victor de Calan and Hans Kasten and other volunteer works from the United States Peace Corps, specifically in March of 1964. So look at the picture. It's actually located in a steep location like that, like a sheer cliff. It seemed to us that the location of our burials are beyond the reach of ordinary individuals. It's placed like in a eagle's nest, like beyond the reach of ordinary people. Like it's difficult to go there. In fact, our archaeologists working on Manunggul Cave need to make a 10-meter stair in order to reach the mouth of the cave. So as they reached the cave, because it is 375 feet high, it's really a tasking work because the cave can only be reached from the side by passing through a gap in the cliff under an overhanging limestone bridge, and then by climbing a sheer cliff. Manunggul Cave is 375 feet high. So as you enter the mouth of the cave, this is actually what meets you. The first view of the chamber A, the cave has many chambers, was a dramatic in its setting. Numerous large jars and jar covers, smaller vessels, skulls, and portions of painted human bones scattered over the surface of the cave. You can imagine. Many of the vessels were either perfect, in nearly perfect condition, or had merely collapsed in their original positions. Striking too was the large number of decorated or painted vessels. So that's the Manunggul Cave, and this is the assemblage of jars that can be found in the cave. Indeed, this cave tells us a lot about our artistic skills and cultural tastes 2,000 years ago. And it is a funerary pottery work, an array of beautiful funerary pottery work, all of them fine works of art. And the most important is the Manunggul Jar. 78 jars, jar covers, and smaller earthenwares were found on the surface and in the subsurface levels of Chamber A of this cave. The range of forms and designs is remarkable and presents a clear example of funerary pottery, vessels for which, for most part, were potted specifically for burial and ritual purposes. These are the words of Robert Fox, the archaeologist who worked on the Manunggul Cave. It is insightful to know that Palawan has many caves, and all of them were dismissed to be culturally important simply because they are located in locations beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. But when Manunggul Cave was discovered, all of the caves in Palawan became a suspect of being an important cultural space for the Katutubo or the indigenous Filipinos. The Manunggul jar was one of the numerous jars found in the cave, which is also a burial site. As we mentioned, the jar is a secondary burial jar, not a primary one. So the cadaver has to be buried somewhere else first before the bones are transferred to this jar because the jar is a secondary burial jar. Mapping on cultural practices in the Philippines, some of our Filipino indigenous tribes believe that when a person dies, the soul do not really leave right away, except when the body parts, especially the meat part of our body, only when the meat part of the body is removed from the bones, like the bone has gone dry already, that the soul started to depart. So that's a belief. So the bones were actually washed in some indigenous tribes and painted with hematite and then transferred to a secondary burial jar like the Manunggul jar. So all the jars in the Manunggul cave is actually a secondary burial jars. Because of its outstanding cultural and artistic value, the jar is hailed as one of the Philippines' cultural treasure. Dated to the late Neolithic period, about 710 up to 809 BC. So the jar and the assemblage is more than 2,000 years old, way beyond the coming of the Spaniards in 1521. So this jar and the jars in the assemblage can actually tell us about who we are as Filipinos before the coming of the Spaniards. So here's what archaeologists and the one who worked on Manunggul Cave, Robert Fox, describe the jar. The burial jar, with a cover featuring a ship of the dead, is perhaps unrivaled in Southeast Asia, the work of an artist and a master potter. The vessel provides a clear example of a cultural link between the archaeological past and the ethnographic present. The boatman is steering rather than paddling the ship. So the picture is how it looks as it is on display on the National Museum of the Filipino people. Further, according to Robert Fox, both figures appear to be wearing a band tied over the crown of the head and under the jaw. I mentioned this. A pattern still encountered in burial practices among indigenous peoples in southern Philippines. The manner in which the hands of the front figure are folded across the chest is also a widespread practice in the islands when arranging the curves. Relative to the ship, the vessel, the style of the Manunggul Jar, it tells us about the culture around us, the practices around the people living in the Philippines. Scholars believe that Southeast Asians first developed a sophisticated maritime culture, which made possible the spread of Austronesian speaking peoples to the Pacific Islands as far as Madagascar in Africa and Easter Island near South America. So, studies had shown, especially DNA studies, had shown that the Philippines and the Filipinos had been and the ancestor of many islanders in the Pacific. The Manunggul Jar shows that the Filipinos' maritime culture is paramount, that it reflected the ancestors' religious beliefs. Many epics around the Philippines would tell us how souls go to the next life, aboard boats, pass through the rivers and the seas. This belief is connected with the Austronesian belief of the Anito. I confirm this because at one time, um, when Undoy, the typhoon Undoy, killed so many people in Mindanao, especially in the city of Iligan, in Lanao del Norte, people talk about a large ship passing by the river collecting souls on its way and then disappearing in the middle of the ocean. And these stories, like urban stories about large boats passing by and then collecting souls, is prevalent in many places in the Philippines, even in the past. So I also hear stories about cholera epidemic in Agusan, Surigao area. And also they've been talking about every year the ship of the dead passes through the river collecting souls among the villages settled near the river every year. And then there is this cholera epidemic killing many people, and they see the ship of the dead passing through. So this is a very common stories in the Philippines. Like there are ships passing with collectors of souls, no? As they pass through a village or a settlement. So the carved prow, referring to the boat, look at the boat. There is an eye motif of the spirit boat is still found on traditional watercrafts of Sulu archipelago, Borneo, and Malaysia. Similarities in the execution of the ears, eyes, nose, and mouth of the figures may be seen today in wood carving in Taiwan, the Philippines, and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. I saw them in the wood carvings of Baguio, for example. The fine lines and intricate designs of the Manunggul Jar reflect the artistry of the early Filipinos. These designs are proof of Filipinos' common heritage with Austronesian speaking ancestors despite the diversity of the culture of the Filipinos. The upper part of the Manunggul Jar, as well as the cover, is carved with curvilinear scroll designs, reminiscent of the waves of the sea, which are painted with hematite red. In many Philippine tribes, red is actually protecting them from evil or from bad souls or evil souls that would possess the bodies inside the jar. So, hematite red or painting the bones red, including the burial jars red, would protect the person inside this jar from evil spirits. So again, its lid is decorated with two human figures riding a boat. So what can we infer from this? We infer that indeed Filipinos believe in the afterlife. And this tableau is actually showing us, manifesting to us a journey into the afterlife. As the context would tell us that the jar is a burial jar. One is steering, while the spirit of the deceased has arms across the chest. So on the faces of the figures and on the prow of the boat are eyes and mouth rendered in the same style as other artifacts in Southeast Asia of that period. So they're telling us about the connection that these artifacts are indeed Asian practice, Asian way of manifesting the eyes and the mouth of dead people. So early Filipinos believed that all things in the universe have a physical body and the soul. No? Simply because they exist, they have life. So because the boat exists, the boat has life. Although not in the definition of biology, the mere existence of the boat, meaning that the boat has life, and that is why the boat has eyes and mouth. That explains why the design of the cover of the Manunggul jar features three faces: the soul, the boatman, and the boat itself. So all has life. All things that are existing in the universe have physical body and a soul. So because they had the eyes of the dead, and for the two individuals, their head has a band of the dead. Are they dead? So that's the question. Or is this the sundo or the relative or the angel who would fetch the dead and bring them to the afterlife? How do we interpret the placement of the second individual who appeared to be dead based on the elements of his eyes and the band tying his head together. So, to continue, the steerman's oar is missing and its paddle. So, you can see that the paddle is missing, as is the mast in the center of the boat, against which the steersman would have braced his feet. The, the manner in which the hands of the front figure are folded again is a widespread practice in the Philippines when arranging the corpse. So, again, the question is, are they all dead? So, let us check the practices of the Filipinos. So, according to an old manuscript, translated by Carlos Quirino and Mauro Garcia, in some places they kill slaves and bury them with their masters in order to serve them in the afterlife. This practice is carried out to the extent that many load a ship with more than 60 slaves, fill it up with food and drink, place the dead on board, and the entire vessel, including the live slaves, are buried in earth. So it has been the practice of the Filipinos in the past that when the master dies, the slave has to be buried with them so that the slave can serve them in the afterlife. I also saw this type of setup among the manubos in Agusan. I saw slaves buried together with the master. The master was in a boat type coffin while the slave is outside the boat coffin. Two slaves, no? And one master in a burial. So the slaves were also killed in order for the slaves to serve the master in the afterlife. So let's go back to the question. Are they all dead? This can be a slave killed in order to paddle the master in the afterlife, to paddle the ship carrying his master in the afterlife, or to steer the ship. Or this could be a relative, the so called sundo, which actually fetches the dead and bring the person, the soul of the person, to the afterlife. So, indeed, the Manunggul Jar has told us a lot of stories. In fact, we can interpret it in a lot of context because written records can only be interpreted based on what's written in the substance of the record. But objects can actually tell us about our past. It's a congealed with information about the past. And we only need some reflexivity that we Filipinos can actually interpret the objects of our past in order to infer our practices, our belief systems, our hierarchies. So, some generalizations from the jar. The Katutubo or the indigenous people believe that the mere existence of an object such as rocks, mountains, or a boat is equivalent to having life. So each and every object found in the universe have life. Not the biological life, like the life we defined it in biology, like it needs consciousness or it needs to react to stimulus, it needs to feed in order to be alive. But the mere existence of the object itself means that it has consciousness and it is alive. The Katutubo believe that life on Earth, or Gaia in modern parlance, is a journey and that there is an afterlife. That we are only here to learn. And learning, we expand our soul And we will never die. Our consciousness continues beyond this body, that the body is the only one who will perish, but the soul continues to the afterlife. The Katutubo live in a hierarchical society where there are slaves, there are masters, skilled individuals such as potters, fishers, jewelry makers, and farmers. So, indeed, the Manunggul Jar tells us that the society have specialized skills or specialization of skills, that there are potters as a means of livelihood. The boat present there could, there are fishers, or we harness the seas, our archipelagic nature of our environment has been harnessed. The Katutubo, in fact, developed a sophisticated maritime culture that everywhere in the Philippines you see boats and watercrafts and balangays, so they say. And in fact, they are so important that the Filipinos buried their dead in boat shaped coffins and jars that have boat design, such as the Manunggul Jar. And the prehistoric Katutubo artistry and artistic flavor is high. So indeed, the said boat, the Manunggul Jar, had expressed or manifested to us so many things. And one of the many things is that it debunked the colonial imagination of the colonizers that indeed the Philippines have no civilization, that we go naked and run into the forest like wild beasts, that we only cover our private parts, and we do not have civilization had they not come. We could be as wretched as our brothers, like we could be forest peoples and cavemen. This object, the Manunggul Jar, debunked all of them. For we have a very high taste for the art, and we have a hierarchical society. We have harnessed the archipelagic nature of our environment, and we have beliefs even about the afterlife. And finally, as a matter of practice among the ancient indigenous Filipinos, we are one with nature. The Filipinos, the indigenous Katutubo, always believe that they and the nature are one. That taking good care of Gaia, taking good care of Mother Earth and the nature is actually taking good care of themselves. They never harvest more than what they need. They never kill animals more than what is needed in their existence. They would just leave the animals in their natural habitat and only kill when necessary for survival. They would never destroy the environment by cutting trees and polluting the rivers. For the rivers are the blood vessels of our indigenous peoples. When you throw garbage into the river, you are effectively injecting poison into your bloodstreams. So, to our native Filipinos, we actually are one with nature. For the food that they eat, they actually eat things raw, or at least they use fire to cook a meat, but they actually eat products of nature raw, like fruits and vegetables in raw, and no preservatives. And we are to learn from these practices. We should go back to some of the native indigenous Filipino practices so that we can have a healthy body, a healthy lifestyle, and we become a better Filipino for a better Philippines and better citizenship for a better world. Thank you very much and have a good day ahead.